Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast, coming to you from Montecito, California. Today is, of course, our Friday show, and it is the show when we do something a little bit different. It all sort of revolves on the concept of some kind of wealth or another. It can be financial wealth. We've done shows on health, which I believe in terms of what we actually possess, it's probably our greatest wealth. The greatest asset that any of us have, and happiness. Happiness relates to a lot of sort of the psychology behind, being happy and that kind of thing. And I thought it would be interesting to talk today about, a quote that I really like and kind of talk a little bit about it. Some legal stuff happening in the space, as some of you know about, and it just leaves me very, very angry. And every time I get this way, I sometimes think about this quote from Warren Buffett, which is, you can always tell someone to go to hell tomorrow, okay? And the genius of this quote is that we all know exactly what he's talking about there. You know what he means. You respond angrily to an email or say something you regret on a text or make a quick and angry bad decision. If you're in a legal situation and you say something you're not supposed to say, and or you're trying to bite your tongue, whatever, it's hard to, because emotions drive that. In fact, even Apple with iPhones recognize that, because now, as you know, if you have an iPhone, you can erase texts a few seconds after pushing the send button. And so I think maybe that was because Steve Jobs was supposed to be a little bit of a hothead too. Who knows? Anyway, how many times have you, been in those situations? Probably many. I certainly have. And you regretted those quick emotional reactions. And, you realize later how much better it would have been if you just kept your mouth shut, or you just didn't send the email, or you didn't text. You just reacted differently in some way. And you wonder, well, why didn't I? Well, what's really going on in your brain when you react out of anger and frustration really comes down to a battle of two parts of your brain, which, the psychologists kind of just say the emotional brain and the rational brain. But as a former neurosurgical resident, I won't talk in such ambiguities. So let me be clear. When we think about how the brain handles emotional versus rational responses, it helps to understand the distinct roles of really sort of two key parts of the brain, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala is part of the brainstem. It is an ancient part of the brain, deeply involved in our emotional responses, especially those tied to survival, right? I mean, these are primordial instincts, right? It's responsible for detecting threats and initiating fast automatic reactions like fear and anger. Think of a caveman running away from a saber-toothed tiger. No time to think there, right? You gotta just react. So in modern day scenarios, when someone cuts you off in traffic, your amygdala goes crazy, and the next thing you know, you have this surge of emotion called road rage. Yes, road rage indeed comes from the amygdala, and it's reacting to someone cutting you off in traffic the same way it would respond to predators or various types of danger in prehistoric times. Now, the prefrontal cortex is different. It is part of the brain that allows for more complex thinking, reasoning, and self-control. It's responsible for critical thinking, decision-making, emotional regulation. And from an evolutionary standpoint, this came last. And it is what makes us uniquely human. Right? This whole concept of just not being all emotion and just not reacting to our cravings. While the amygdala tells you, react now, the prefrontal cortex is kind of saying, all right, pause, hold on, let's think about this. It weighs long-term consequences. It considers societal norms. It helps you decide whether emotional response in that situation is actually going to be productive or appropriate. Now, here's where it gets interesting, though. In situations that provoke those strong emotions, frequently what happens is the amygdala can basically hijack the entire decision-making process. Why? Well, it's fast, right? It's fast. It operates automatically. It tends to dominate. when we're faced with these short-term, stressful situations, like when we're threatened or stressed. That whole scenario is called the amygdala hijack, which you might enjoy telling someone the next time you say something you didn't mean. You can be like, "Hey, bro, sorry, amygdala hijack," or something like that. Maybe you can laugh it off or something. But yeah, it's amygdala hijack. Another way to think about it is that the amygdala is kind of a sprinter, right? While the prefrontal cortex is the marathon runner. The amygdala reacts quickly. It's got like the short burst, and it doesn't pause to reflect because its goal is immediate action. Immediate action. You got to do it now, whether that's yelling in frustration or running from danger. And the prefrontal cortex, well, it takes longer to engage. It's focused on long-term planning and thoughtful decision-making. So in those first few seconds of an emotional surge, it might not have enough time to stop that amygdala. In short, emotional responses dominate in the short term, and that's why you end up in those situations. But here's the challenge. While the amygdala might be really good at handling those immediate threats, it often overreacts to non-life-threatening situations, especially in the context of modern life. So a tense email from a coworker, a critical comment on social media, that can feel like an attack, right? And it can trigger the amygdala's instinct response, again, to defend or retaliate. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, when given the time, can evaluate that situation and really ask, is it really worth my energy? This interplay is why, under stress or high emotion, people tend to make impulsive decisions, right? It's essentially an overwhelming of the amygdala of the prefrontal cortex. So the key is you got to give it a little bit of time. You have to figure out how to give the prefrontal cortex a chance to catch up to that amygdala that's way out front, right? And that's why people always talk about, hey, why don't you sleep on it? Making decisions basically during emotional moments doesn't really give your prefrontal cortex a chance to engage in the situation, right? And of course, not sleeping on it can result in major consequences. The best one, well, not the best one, but one that I remember certainly, well, it was in 2022. Remember when Will Smith walked onto the stage and slapped Chris Rock after Rock made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith, his wife, right in the front of millions of viewers, right? Crazy that he would do that. But basically what happened is he just, he reacted immediately to defend his wife. I mean, kind of like, sort of caveman reaction, amygdala hijack. If Smith had paused even for just a few minutes, maybe his prefrontal cortex would have helped him out. But instead, what did he get? Banned from attending the Oscars for 10 years. Lots of criticism from both public and his peers. He had a bunch of other issues. I don't even remember what, but related to his acting career, but something I'm sure he regrets. Now, on the other hand, once in a while, the prefrontal cortex comes out on top. And when it does, it can really help. And luckily, that was the case during the Cold War. Of course, those were times of high tension between the United States and the former Soviet Union. I remember being a little kid, and I remember 1983. I was about 10 years old, and at that time, it was that year that Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov received a report indicating that the U.S. had launched missiles towards the Soviet Union. Of course, nuclear missiles, right? And the protocol that Stanislav Petrov was supposed to follow was that he was supposed to launch a retaliatory strike immediately. But you know what? He didn't. He actually paused for a moment against even his own training and all the pressure at the moment, and he reasoned that it was a false alarm. He actually don't know exactly what it is. You should look it up. I remember watching a documentary on this. It's pretty crazy. But anyway, his decision not to act impulsively likely prevented nuclear war. And that's, we're sitting here talking and listening to podcasts instead of the world being up in smoke. So anyway, that's an example of when what can happen if you just wait a minute and let the prefrontal cortex catch up. But of course, you don't need to cite the Oscars or the Cold War to see this, this war between brains at play. It's something that happens every day. Coworkers, throwing you under the bus, client making unreasonable demands. You feel the heat rising. You want to respond right away. And that's where emotional intelligence comes in. what psychologist Daniel Goleman calls self-regulation. Self-regulation is it's simply the ability to keep your cool when your emotions are boiling over. So the smartest leaders are the ones who know when not to respond. They take a beat, let the frustration simmer down, and then come back with a solution instead of a knee-jerk reaction. And guess what? That makes you look more professional, more in control, and way more trustworthy. Now, there is a technique in psychology called cognitive reframing, and it's all about changing the way you look at a situation to change how you feel about it. When you take a moment before reacting, you give yourself the opportunity to see things from a different angle. For example, let's say somebody sends you a harsh email. Your first instinct, again, might be to fire back and defend yourself. But what if you pause for a minute and think, well, maybe they're having a bad day, or maybe there's a misunderstanding here. I mean, for heaven's sake, in the era of text and email, tone is really difficult to interpret. I just remember when I was married all the time. I'm a really, like, as far as texting goes, I'm like a one sentence guy max in emails in general too. So if I ever get like a long text, I respond with like just a few words, or a long email, I respond with a few words. When I was married, my ex used to always say, "Are you mad or something?" I'm like, "No, this is the way I am." Anyway, by reframing the situation, right, you can respond with a lot more empathy and just don't expect the worst. And you could, and that if you do that, you can turn a potentially ugly exchange into an opportunity to strengthen a relationship. So what does this mean for you? Whether you're in a high stakes negotiation or just trying to handle, a frustrating situation at work, there's something called the power of the pause. It's something you should lean into. And that power of the pause is just another way of saying what Buffett described before. He said, you can always tell someone to go to hell tomorrow. When I think about that, when I try to think about that in those situations, it actually kind of makes me laugh. And that in and of itself actually triggers a little bit of a pause for me some of the time. Certainly not all, I would say, and maybe not even most, but I can be a little bit of a hothead sometimes. But in this day today, when I am sort of pissed off at some of the things that I am involved with and people I have associated with, I give you this advice that you can always tell somebody to go to hell tomorrow. That's it for me, Buck Joffrey with Wealth Formula Podcast. Have a nice weekend.